Okay, so SQLite, right? .NET Core MVC likes SQLite and works very well with it. So it's an alternate database system we can use. First of all, what is it? It's an in-process library that basically it's a single file contains the entire database. It is, as noted here, the most widely deployed database in the world. There's something like more than 1 trillion active databases in use in SQLite around the world. If you have a smartphone, you have probably dozens of SQLite databases on your smartphone. Just about every app you install uses SQLite database for internal storage. All the smart TVs in the world use it. Tons and tons of applications, websites, etc. Okay, it's in the public domain, totally free to use, both for educational and commercial purposes. So you can make money using SQLite. That's totally according to the license that there is, right? Obviously, there's some limitations to the system, but the main one we have to be concerned about is it doesn't allow concurrent write access. In other words, if somebody's writing or storing data in the database, only one person can do it at a time. So you immediately might think, ooh, that's going to limit how many users we could have working on our website if it's, if the back end is SQLite. And yes, there's the truth to that, right? But as I noted here, this is right from their website. Generally speaking, any site that gets fewer than 10K hits a day would probably work fine with SQLite. So I don't know about you, but I don't think I have any websites up that get that many hits anyway. So, although there's a clear warning here that obviously there's going to be a limitation, right? The fact that only one write operation can be happening at a time is going to limit how many simultaneous users can be writing to the database. But, in practice, it's probably not the biggest limitation that you'd ever think about coming across. Most of the other limitations are well beyond anything that we've probably ever conceived we'd have to worry about unless you're working in a very large enterprise system. So it's interesting to see how wide we use this is and that we can use it so easily ourselves. One of the main reasons we're going to look at doing it is it's free, right? And hosting it in Azure, our website itself was free, but one of the things we've been concerned about is SQL Server isn't free. So if we forget to turn off SQL Server, then we're going to just every day be using up a bit of our allotment of money that we have as a student, right? And use it all up in short order and not have enough left to do the other courses that we want to do. But this way, there's no cost whatsoever. All right. So how do we use it with .NET Core? Well, I'm going to assume that first of all, we have a fully working site, okay? And we're going to convert it. So that's what I'm going to do today right now. So the first thing is this NuGet package. Okay, so we have to install that, and that's basically it. Now, I've got a note here about for version core 2.2, that's the SDK that we have installed in our lab image here. Then the most recent version that is compatible with that is this as shown here, 2.2.6. If you're using .NET Core 3, then there are newer versions of this NuGet package as well to go along with that. But for us, we better stick with the 2.2.6. And once we get that in place, then really it's a matter of just going into our startup.cs file and where we configure services, telling all of our DB context to use SQLite instead of use SQL Server, right? That's basically what we do. One quick change there. And then, of course, our code will still reference a connection string, and we'll have to change those, right? So in our app settings JSON file, I will typically, because I'm planning on doing this mainly so I can publish it to Azure, I'll usually have 2 different copies of the connection strings. Now I'll just talk for a moment about the fact you're seeing still 2 connection strings here. I'm going to assume we're going to go with that, but more so, even more important, I'm going to actually use 2 separate databases. One for the default connection, which we know is our identity, our security system, and then one for our production tables, right? The examples here, of course, are based on our medical office in-class example that we've been doing. The reason for having 2 separate databases, obviously, right? If there's a limitation on writes, why not just separate it? There's no need to have them in the same database. There's no referential integrity between them or anything like that. So we might as well keep them separate, okay? Because we can easily have multiple SQLite databases and access them simultaneously. So the difference between the local and the Azure versions is just the path. You'll be interested to note that when your app is published to Azure, the path for the root of your website is always the same. At least it has been for the last few years. They don't promise it'll never change, but it hasn't so far. So I've got that hard-coded into this connection string. There are ways you can find some help online if you want to dynamically find out the path in the file system of your root folder, but hey, this just seems to work. All right? So the idea is that you would just comment out and comment in, so to speak, the particular connection string you need to use. But it's really neat that this whole database is just a single file, and that's all there is to it. All right, well, with that much in mind, I'm going to stop the PowerPoint. I think that was almost the end of it anyway. And we're going to go, I've got a copy-paste file that has all that information we've covered so far, plus more. So I'm going to steal a bit from it as we go through, and I'm going to install this package first of all, right? So I have Visual Studio open. Actually, I should stop it running. I just was doing an initial run to make sure everything was working. This is the latest version of our medical office. So we're going to go down into our NuGet Package Manager and into the console, right? So I'll just put that install package command in there. The one was same as in our PowerPoint. And we'll let that run. There we go. All right, done. Let's come down to our settings in startup.cs where we configure services, right? So here we see, okay, here's for our application DB context. If I even backspace out, you can see it's right there in IntelliSense. When I hit the dot, instead of use SQL Server, I can get use SQLite. Now it wouldn't have been there in the pop-up menu here for IntelliSense a moment ago, but because I ran the NuGet package, it is there now, right? So I can just do the same thing. That's for the application DB context. Just come down here further where my production tables are, my medical office context, and I'll put the same in there. There we go, right? Now the only thing next is our connection string. So coming down to the connection strings, they're in app settings JSON, right? So these are the two using SQL Server. Now I'm not going to remove them. I'm just going to comment those out. And I'll just add these new ones, right? Oop, didn't mean to do that. I meant to hit end. Okay, so I'll get them out of my copy-paste file again. Okay. So now I've made the assumption that I want to create these database files inside the data folder, as I do most things that are related to the database itself. It doesn't have to be. We could put it anywhere else, but I'll just switch which ones are active at the moment by changing the commenting here. So I'm going to be working locally at this point in time, so I'll use the local version. So it's kind of nice as well that we have just this relative reference, okay, to our website root folder. So that means that when you get these created and you pick up your project folder and take it with you from one computer to another, the database is now self-contained, right? In the past, we were always leaving the database behind and having to recreate it when we moved from one computer to another. So now the actual database will just be there as part of the solution folder itself. Okay, I'll just save that change. We're almost ready to go, right? I say almost because there's a few differences that we should be aware of, right? It's quite compatible with .NET Core and even code-first development and migrations and the whole business, but there's a little bit of a twist there. And actually, I haven't had time to put this all into the PowerPoint, but I do have it here in my copy-paste file. So let me just bring that over here for a second. Okay, so that's it, okay? But there are significant differences between SQLite and SQL Server, okay? In a certain number of areas. So this is a reference I have here. It's a document on the web. Let me just bring it up here. Bring the browser over. Okay, so this is right from the Microsoft documentation. SQLite Entity Framework Core Database Provider Limitations. Okay, so first of all, notice schemas, right? We've been using schemas for our production tables, and that's great in SQL Server. Doesn't get support here in SQLite. But the good news about that is it doesn't care about our code asking for schemas. It will just ignore it, right? So if you want, I could just go in and comment out that request to set a schema in the DB context. But you know, if I don't bother, it really isn't a big deal because it'll just ignore it anyway. So it doesn't really hurt, okay? There are certain data types, okay, that aren't supported by SQLite. I haven't been using any datetime offsets or time spans, and or any. Well, the only one I've been using here is decimal. But you know what? They suggest a fix here using the Fluent API that we can tell anything with a decimal property to convert it to double. Guess what though? I didn't do that, and yet still my decimal that I'm using for, what is it? I think the fee for the patient appointment, and it's working fine. So I think maybe this documentation is a little bit behind, and they've actually made a change with the latest version because it seems to be working without any problem, right? There is, as I note in my notes here, besides schemas that aren't supported, migrations, okay, it works fine with some, but not all of the migration commands, okay? And we see that reflected here. If I just go back to that site down a little further, migration limitations, it shows which of the commands that we see in our up and our down of our migrations are supported. The ones that aren't, like add foreign key, add primary key, add, right? Notice that they're pretty much always commands that work with an existing table and change it, right? Adding a column, adding a primary key, etc., right? Making drops and so on. The ones that don't work very well work with an existing table. So I have a bottom line suggestion to make. Do what we've done in the past. Whenever migrations kind of get messed up and you have a hard time synchronizing the database with your migrations, I've told people over and over again, just get rid of them and start a new set with the current state of your model, right? If you make a new initial migration, it will just take the current model as you have it designed, as reflected in your model classes, and then write a migration based on that, right? So the reason is we can't incrementally apply a lot of the changes, but we can do it in the initial migration. So let me just come into data here. I'm going to open my PM commands file because I'm going to be using it. So that whole MO migrations folder, right, under data, I'm going to remove it, but I'm going to want to be able to recreate it. So I'm going to change my little add migration here like that, okay, in my little text file where I keep track of my commands. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete the whole migrations folder. And then I will recreate it in the Package Manager console with this command. We'll just come down to the Package Manager console again. The difference is though, right, initial, is it will do all the work to get a database created exactly as per our model design in a single migration, right? Okay, you saw a bit of yellow go by there quickly, if you're watching. That's just all this reference to being configured to use a schema. Okay, well, SQLite does not support schemas, so it's just been ignored, right? So it's up to you. You can take out the schema out of the DB context, but it just gets ignored anyway. Okay, all right, now there is something that we've never done before. I've always sort of been teaching that we don't come into the migration and change code because we want to be able to recreate it at any point in time. But we're about to talk about another limitation that we have to deal with. Okay, so migrations is great, okay? Don't update the database yet because we need to manually make a change. Manually make a change to our migration file. Talking about data types, okay, as I said, pretty much all the ones listed there are fine, but our good old timestamp, okay, or row version as we usually call it, doesn't quite work in SQLite. Now, it is true that it will create, like our code right now, as our migration is written, it will create the field in the table. It will be a blob, a binary large object. That's the data type in SQLite, which works just fine to hold the byte array that we would normally want to create. But the value is never changed. It's null, and it will never be changed by SQLite on its own. So in other words, all that work we did, getting all that nice concurrency code in, showing the difference between the values and the stored in the database and what the user is entering, all that work would be useless, right? Even though the timestamp field is there, it never changes. So there is a workaround. Okay, I found a nice article here that you can go and look at this fellow's work, but basically I've just taken it and put it into this bit of code here, right? So this is specifically written for the patient table for our row version property, but what we're going to do is use Triggers. Yes, you remember triggers, right? Right back from Prog 1198. So we can actually use our migration builder to execute any SQL we want. And there's other ways to get these in place, but this is the easiest that I know of. So I'm just going to copy this code here and come over to our initial migration. So if I just come down to where we create the patient table, okay, I'll do a control find for patient. Okay, there we are. I was almost there anyway. All right, so here's our table. And if I roll down here on the screen, there's our row version. See how it's being created just fine. Okay, it's a byte, holds a byte array. It's nullable. Row version is true. That's the reason why Entity Framework will look for a change in values here, and will automatically add that to the condition of any SQL command updating and so on, right? Because of that. But the trouble is the database won't change it for us. So we're going to come down here right after the table is finishing being built, and I'll paste in my code. Okay? All right, it just didn't get the indentation the way I would want, but I can just quickly fix that. It's not actually important, but kind of nice to make it look consistent. Okay, so we're going to create a trigger here for the update event of patients, where we set the row version just to this is a built-in function, random blob, right? So we'll create a random binary large object, and the same thing on insert. Okay, so insert and update, so we'll always have a random blob in there. And guess what? That will do the job. Because when Entity Framework compares the value of this timestamp value, I mean, the odds of creating a binary large object randomly twice with the same value is pretty darn small. So we have a very high confidence that we'll catch any concurrency errors this way that we would have otherwise. So it's just a workaround, but I've tested it and it seems to work very, very well, right? Now, because we're manually modifying our migration here, I'm going to come back to these commands and just put a note down here. If recreating the initial migration, include this for row timestamp. Right, just so I have the code handy, because I'd have to manually put it back in if I ever deleted the migration and had to create it again, right? So you see, it's not ideal, right, because we can't just automatically make a correct migration. We have to manually go in and tweak it, but it does get the job done for us, and in a relatively painless way. Okay, all right, so now that I have that, I've modified this migration. I'll just save those changes. I'm going to now actually update the database, and I'm ready to do so. Okay, so I might as well just update database for my medical office. And then I'll update database. Might as well do it for the application DB context as well. And there we go. All right. So if I look in the data folder now, there's my medical office DB, and here's my medical office identity DB. Okay. Now I did, as I noted in the instructions, or I had a little tip there in Blackboard. There is this extension here. Okay. The SQLite compact toolbox. You can install this into Visual Studio. It takes about a minute, okay? And then I can connect. See, I even found them, right? So there's my medical office. I can expand this, right? See all the tables, et cetera, and so I can work in here very much the same way as I'm familiar with. Edit top 200 rows. I can see the doctors. I haven't run it yet, so it hasn't seeded the data, right? Okay, we'll do that in a second then. Okay. So I might as well do that. Let's go ahead and run it. Well, I should have done a build first. Odds are I might have to run it a second time here. Kickstart that seed data to make sure it actually runs. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to, so I'm going to just stop and do it again. Okay. And there we go. There's my data, right? Everything should be working pretty well. Here's my security. Yep, so I'm logging in as administrator. And, let's just check that things seem to be working. Right? There's all my code there. If I edit, I can do all my many-to-many work here. Yeah, and it's adding them all. Let's just try. Oh, one thing I know won't work. Okay? If I go to delete this, okay, that one worked. Funny. All right. Oh no, well, it's giving me the message, which is not the specific one, right? Unable to save changes because I didn't catch the specific name in the message, right? One thing I think, if I go into patients, let me just grab Fred's SIN number or OHIP number. SIN number, silly me. And go back to the patient list. Let's edit Jane, give her that one, and save. Okay, so you see I'm just getting generic messages. I'm not getting the specific messages, right? Okay, so that's another thing we'll deal with in just a few moments. But for the most part, it seems to be working. Let me just start afresh here. I'm going to edit Fred, and let's simulate our concurrency. So I'll open 2 tabs, editing the same record. Okay, I'll make a change here, maybe bump that up to 12. Change the phone number and the doctor maybe, right? Now I should be able to save this, but if I come back to this version where I was editing, I'll put this down to 2, for example. He likes to go by Freddie, and the date of birth I had wrong. He's a couple years older than that, right? I'll save that, and there we go. So it caught our timestamp. Yay! Right? So the random blob is working, and we're still getting all of our wonderful feedback that we coded in. So it's amazing that pretty much everything is working with just those couple quick changes, and we're able to use a totally different database system, right? The only thing that we weren't catching are exact error messages, and we'll deal with that in just a moment or two. Okay, so if I come back here, right? So DbUpdateExecption error messages. Okay, the wording is different in the messages sent back from this particular database. So if you want to catch it exactly, you can always set a breakpoint and look at the message. That's what I did. And what I noticed is that pretty much all the ones that are to do with any unique constraint, if you look in the message for the word unique, you'll find it. Okay. If it's a foreign key constraint, like you've got a situation with parent-child records and you don't have cascade deletes, you go to delete a doctor with patients, right? Then it will say foreign key, but I'm happy just to look for the word foreign, right? So just by a couple quick changes, then we'll have our logic in place to actually catch the specific error and be able to give specific feedback for exactly what's going on, right? So I'm just going to do a quick search and replace here for this text, not search and replace, but I'll search through my project. Okay, so I'll just do Control F. Oh well. So I'll look for that in the entire solution. That's fine. Find next. Okay, so here's one here. So that's mentioning the foreign key constraint, right? Here we were looking for the specific name of the, but that name is different now. So instead, I'm just going to use the keyword foreign to look for that inside, right? So I'll put that in place. Okay, find the next. Oh, I guess I found the same one again. All right, so there's that foreign key again. I'll replace that. Shouldn't be too many more. Okay, now here's where we're looking for our unique OHIP number, right? So for this one, I'll just put the word unique. So that's it. I found them all. All right, so now when we run, we will actually get the proper error messages in all of those situations. So just to prove that quickly, I'll just do the maybe the doctor delete. Oh, I have to log in. Remember me, please. Okay, now I'm getting the specific message: you cannot delete a doctor that has patients, right? So simple as that, eh? Really relatively painless to convert this. Now it's fully functioning with our self-contained database right in our project folder. All right. Now, last thing we might want to do is publish this to Azure, right? Oh, I should maybe mention then, to work with the SQLite database in Visual Studio, right? I have the link here to that toolbox. It's pretty good, but I want to mention there's another one out there. You can go to this link. This is a separate tool, so if you ever want to work with SQLite outside of Visual Studio itself, you can just come here and download this one. Excuse me. It's free, it's open source, and you go to the download link, grab, well, this is probably the one you're going to want, and it's a nice separate application. In fact, I found it's a little bit more powerful. It quickly gives you access to all the triggers and everything else. It seemed to be almost a bit more complete than the one built into Visual Studio, but I haven't really compared them completely side by side, so don't quote me on that specifically, but it's an alternate way you can connect to your SQL or your SQLite database system. Okay. Last point I want to make then is about publishing to Azure, right? So if we publish to Azure, there's a couple things we want to make. Make sure you change your connection strings first. And the other thing I found that seems to make a difference, at least the first time, right, is when we publish, we want to just change one of the ways that Visual Studio deals with these actual database files, right? So if I go to the properties of this database file, right now copy to output directory is set to do not copy. So I'm going to say copy if newer. I could say, I think either of those would work fine. Copy always as well. I'll just say copy if newer, okay? I'll just do that before, and I'm going to do a clean and rebuild just because I'm paranoid. I always like to do that every once in a while. Okay, so now I should be ready to publish to Azure. This is so much easier, right, than doing it when you're using SQL Server, because there's a lot of work goes into configuring the SQL Server itself as part of the process that now we don't have to bother with, okay? So I'm just going to come up to the top. I will right-click and say Publish. Now I'm logged into Visual Studio with the same account, of course, I use for Azure, and that will be the same for you. So if you haven't gone in and activated your Azure, you should do so, right? So I'm going to create a new web app, okay? Now normally this advanced business, this is all about configuring, whether you need databases to be published and code first migrations applied and so on. I can just forget all that, don't need it. Okay, I'll just click Publish. So here it comes up for the app service. Websites are app services, by the way. So this is the suggested name. Okay, it uses the date time here, which is not very helpful. I'm going to go with something nice and short, M-O, well, maybe I won't use an underscore, SQLite demo. Okay. If it's not unique, it'll let you know, but it has to be unique. Everyone in the world can use this, right? This actually becomes a subdomain in front of AzureWebsites.net. So that's why it has to be unique. So my subscription is Azure for Students. I'm going to show you creating a new resource group, right? Just make up a name, something that makes sense. I usually put RG at the end of my resource group, so RG, just so I know it's a resource group. The idea of a resource group is it allows you to group resources, right? So if you want to pick them up from one subscription, maybe later on you're going to decide, I'm going to keep using Azure, I'm going to get a pay-as-you-go subscription. Then you can pick up the resource group and just move it from the one subscription to the other, right? Things like that. Or delete the entire resource group. Okay, I need a hosting plan, so I'll do that. SQL, that's fine, ends in plan there. Central Canada, that seems good. Everything here is fine. Okay, all right. And I don't have to worry at all about a storage account or a SQL database because I have my own built in. So I just click create. This is the easiest publish I've ever had to do. It takes it a few moments here, deploying and so on. So this screen will disappear after it's finished creating the resource group and the hosting plan. And then we'll see the actual publish process happen separately. Okay, that dialog box has gone away. So now we just have the regular publish. This is what you're going to see all the time. So the idea is you can make whatever changes to the code of your application, just click publish again, and then in a matter of moments. Now the first time it takes the longest because it has to upload the entire site. But from then on, if you just make a small change somewhere, then it only has to, basically put up the differences, right? Now mind you, of course, a lot of it's compiled into a DLL, and so that will be just replaced with a new version of the DLL, but still it's very fast for subsequent changes. All right, so do I have data? Drum roll please, look at that. Okay, so here I'm fully live on Azure, okay, with a HTTPS, and there's my fully working, I can log in, okay, with my admin account, for example, and then I have access to everything, right, my security, the whole bit, and it's fully functional with all the features that I would expect to have and totally free, right? Bada bing, bada boom, what do you think? SQLite, the way to go? What I do suggest is if you're going to publish it to Azure, when your finalized version is done, make a copy. All right, don't just do it to the one copy you have. Make a copy of it and convert it to use SQLite for the purpose of publishing to Azure, right? But actually, it's surprisingly fast. It's very efficient. It's, unless you had a whole bunch of users at once, you would never see an issue. And when I say a whole bunch, probably far more than I'm even choosing to worry about before you'd actually ever see a problem with it. Okay, well that's my end of my discussion.